I'm Tom Ross, and I'm the president of the Volcker Alliance. It's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon as we continue our discussion on preventing the next state budget crisis. We thank you for being here. My purpose as you continue to eat your lunch is to introduce our keynote speaker, Dick Ravitch, the former lieutenant governor of the state of New York, and also to introduce Lois Scott, who will be in conversation with Dick in just a few moments. However, before I begin those introductions, I'd like to take a moment to express my personal thanks and those of the Volcker Alliance to our partners for this event and to a number of people who were critical in making today's event appear successful thus far. At least I've been told by others it's successful. We certainly think so. So let me again thank the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. What wonderful hosts they are being, providing us with delicious food and an incredibly beautiful building in which to meet. We thank them for hosting us today. We also thank the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and the Pew Charitable Trust for partnering with the Volcker Alliance on this event. We appreciate their generosity and their participation, which has been terrific so far. I also want to take a moment and personally thank the staff of the Volcker Alliance who've worked very hard on this event for a number of months. Many of them are here. I'll ask them just to stand where they are so you'll know who they are, if they would, wherever they're seated. Many of them may be standing already, like Melissa Austin in the back, but thank you for, and I really want to take a moment and thank Bill Glaskell and his team, Melissa and Noah particularly, but Robert Chislett and Henry Owens that have worked so hard on this event, but have also worked for now several years on this project and have produced one wonderful report, which I'll mention in a moment, with more to come. So allow me to take just a moment and tell you a bit about the Volcker Alliance and why we care about preventing the next state budget crisis. The Volcker Alliance was launched in 2013 by Paul Volcker, best known to all of us in this room for sure, for his service to our nation as chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1979 to 1987 during the battle against stagflation. Mr. Volcker has served in and out of government most of his career. He's a passionate public servant, a believer in the need for a government that effectively carries out the will of the people. And the mission of the Volcker Alliance is to advance effective management of government to achieve results that matter to citizens. We are a nonpartisan organization interested in good government at all levels, including, as you can tell from today's discussion, in each of our 50 states. The roots of the Truth and Integrity in State Budgeting Initiative preceded the Volcker Alliance. They trace back to the State Budget Crisis Task Force, which was co-chaired by Paul Volcker and Dick Ravitch. From 2011 to 2012, the task force examined the financial condition of 6 of the nation's most populous states: California, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, Texas, and Virginia. And they did so in the aftermath of the deepest economic downturn since the Great Depression. They convened national dialogues on high-priority topics that, unfortunately, will still resonate with you today. Topics such as improving the state-federal partnership of Medicaid, managing the impact of the federal deficit reduction, unfunded pension promises, and increasing transportation funding to benefit the economy. Allow me, if I may, to read to you a brief excerpt from a statement issued by Mr. Ravitch and Mr. Volcker upon the release of the final task force report in January of 2014, and I quote, "National inattention to the financial pressure bearing down on state and local government can no longer be tolerated. What is at stake is the strength of our educational institutions, of our infrastructure and public systems, of our healthcare and judicial systems, and of the safety and security of American society. What is required is the recognition of the collective responsibility of our federal and state governments for action. It is, after all, our children and grandchildren who will pay the price of failure and who will have to cope with the diminished strength and competitiveness of the American Republic. It's been now nearly 5 years since that statement was issued. Dick Ravitch and Paul Volcker have a knack for presenting problems, often before others are paying quite as much attention, and they do so with clarity and urgency. So with Dick's blessing, the Volcker Alliance decided to continue the work of the task force and to focus in on some of the budget and fiscal practices that have been spotlighted in the task force preliminary analysis. As I believe most of you know here today, under the leadership of Bill Glaskell, the Alliance launched a multi-year study to assess and grade the quality of budget practices in all 50 states. Last year, we released the results in our first year of analysis. If you haven't already seen that report, you can pick one up at the front table where you came in the hallway. And our second report, covering fiscal years 2016 through 18, will be released in December. Over the summer, we also launched a data lab available on the Volcker Alliance website that enables users to download data sets and bring close to 4,000 data points to life through interactive charts and visual comparison tools. So now let me turn to my task at hand, to our keynote conversation, which features Dick Ravitch. Dick is a longtime public servant, as well as a successful businessman. He is a lawyer by trade that has had a successful career in his family real estate development business, HRH Construction. In his public life, he has held important positions in public service in New York, notably as lieutenant governor, and earlier in his career as chairman of the state's Urban Development Corporation and as chairman and CEO of the Metropolitan Transit Authority, which oversees New York subways. Dick, will you come back? The subways need you, let me tell you. I have to ride those things. We need you back. But Dick is one of those people who has public service in his blood, and he is constantly helping to make this nation a better place, whether in official positions or as a friendly advisor or simply as a concerned and highly informed citizen. He is not one to shy away from a challenge. He has served on numerous boards and commissions, ranging from the United States Commission on Urban Problems in the 1960s to the Millennial Housing Commission in 2000. When Detroit faced physical crisis, and then Puerto Rico, who voluntarily dove into the weeds to understand the problem and picked up the phone to see how he could help advise key players. It was Dick. If you want to know more about this remarkable man, I would sincerely recommend, and I mean sincerely recommend, that you take a look at and read his autobiography, entitled So Much to Do, A Full Life of Business, Politics, and Confronting Fiscal Crises. Dick will be joined today in conversation by Lois Scott. Lois has a distinguished career as well, both in business and public service. Lois started her career at First Chicago, now J.P. Morgan. She quickly rose in the investment banking field to become one of the youngest principals at Donaldson, Lufkin & Jenrette, now Credit Suisse. She helped to relaunch the Bank of America's public finance effort in the Midwest, for which she won widespread praise as well as awards. She founded a fiscal services firm with offices all over the United States. Lois has served as a White House fellow and advised the Clinton administration on the financial crisis in Southeast Asia. She has also served as the CFO to the city of Chicago for 4 years and on the boards of numerous profit and for-profit nonprofit organizations. Please join me in welcoming Dick Ravitch and Lois Scott for what I know will be an interesting conversation.
Thank you. What a privilege this is. Mutual.
Before I begin, I'm going to take a point of privilege as a speaker here and just say how much this man means to me. He has been nothing short of a role model, a personal mentor, and an inspiration. So thank you, Dick, for what you've done for me in my life in the public sector and what you've done for the American public at large. Thank you.
Very sweet. Thank you.
I also want to say I'm speaking as a private citizen. I serve on various boards, but I'm speaking as Lois Scott today as I'm talking to you. So for those watching from home, this is my heartfelt, my own views and not those of any organization I'm affiliated with. Okay, Dick, we're going to dive in. You have been around fiscal distress for the better part of 50 years. And I want you to frame it from the beginning and your New York City experience, and then we're going to get a little more current. So why don't we begin with New York City and the financial crisis that really consumed that whole city and state, and how that was resolved, and what lessons were there for what we're dealing with today.
In 1975, May 2nd, the chairman of Citibank, J.P. Morgan, and the president of Chase asked to see the governor. And I'd been involved in the crisis of a public benefit corporation called the Urban Development Corporation. And the governor's secretary associated me with banks. So she suggested, or she called me and told me to come to the governor's office. I had no idea what the meeting was about. Walter Wriston, chairman of Citibank, turned to Governor Hugh Carey and said, "We will no longer underwrite the notes and bonds of the city of New York." I was flabbergasted. I understood the significance of it, but I thought, what the hell am I doing here? I think the governor may have had a pop or two at lunch, so he didn't have much to say. And I said, effective when? And Wriston said, effective immediately. So there was silence. They got up and left. I then called the city controller and asked for a schedule of all of the city's maturing debt and, of course, their cash position. And there was a story in the Wall Street Journal that morning that a guy by the name of Paul Volcker had been named president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Well, I knew that the Fed had the statutory power to make emergency loans to municipalities. So sitting there confronted with what I could only imagine as a potential catastrophe for the city, I asked a mutual or somebody who had served with Volcker in the Treasury Department to introduce me. And that night, I took Paul Volcker to dinner at a famous steakhouse in New York, and it was the first time he said no to me. But the serious point of the story is that in 1965 or so, the mayor of the city of New York went to the governor of the state of New York and said, "We need more state aid." And the governor said, "I have no more money to give you, but I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make it easier for you to borrow." And he amended the public finance law of the state of New York to permit the city to issue revenue anticipation notes and bond anticipation notes in amounts equal to what the mayor estimated he would be receiving in the subsequent 12 months. The law before that change had limited the amount of short-term borrowing the city could do to amounts that they had actually received the year before. So between 66, 67, and 75, the city had accumulated almost $7 billion of short-term notes, which were maturing, which I might add they had no capacity to pay except by reborrowing. Well, too long a story to go into detail, but essentially what we did, three things. We created a control board, which had jurisdiction over the city's budgetary decisions. We ultimately got the federal government to agree to lend a few $1 billion at 100 basis points over their cost of funds. And we passed a law taking the sales tax away from the city of New York and made it payable to a new, governmental entity called Municipal Assistance Corporation. And we issued debt against the Municipal Assistance Corporation and said to the banks, you got to buy the debt. Originally, they said, you got to be kidding. You want us to buy a bond secured by a revenue that we had every right to believe belonged to the general obligation bondholders, of which we are one? To which our response was meek but clear. If you don't, we're going to file under Chapter 9. It wasn't Chapter 9, it was Chapter 7 then. Well, the banks set off against bank account. Anyway, to make a long story short, the banks blinked. They bought the MAC bonds. And then the union pension funds bought the MAC bonds. And New York went through a period of austerity, of significant tax increases at the state level, a takeover by the state of the court system and the higher education system to relieve, forgive me over here, my back. I'm oversimplifying a very complicated story. But the most important thing that we did, we passed a law that required the city of New York to budget in accordance with GAAP, to budget on an accrual basis. Because we were fully aware of the fact that even though public employee unions had no right to bargain collectively until the early 60s, what they got during the halcyon days of the 60s, the Great Society, and government expansion, and all the additional services that were provided by government, and the size of the city government tripled, they got wage increases. Not unreasonable, given the fact that a lot of them had required skills that were competitive in the private sector. But when the recession hit, the politicians said, we got no more money to give you. Tell you what we'll do. We'll give you promises to give you money when you retire. And they said to themselves, that ain't going to cost us anything. We don't have to budget. So all of a sudden, there began to be commitments for retirement benefits, healthcare benefits, that had no budgetary impact whatsoever in the years those promises were made. And we insisted by the change in the law that the city had to budget on an accrual basis. The city of New York has not had a fiscal crisis since then. I'll tell you one more story, Lois. In 2014, right after a citywide election, the city controller called me on a Sunday morning and he said, we think my GAAP experts tell me de Blasio's draft budget doesn't conform to GAAP. And I don't want to get into a political fight with de Blasio at this point. Would you do me a favor? Meet with the GAAP expert on tomorrow morning, Monday morning, and tell me whether de Blasio's right or not. So I met. What de Blasio had done was he entered into a contract with the teachers. He wanted to give them back pay because they hadn't had a contract in 5 years. And he agreed to give them a very significant amount of back pay, but none of it was to be paid in the year in which the budget was being passed. It was all to be paid in years 2, 3, and 4. And There is no question that that should have been charged to the budget in the year the commitment was made. And de Blasio, with no newspaper comment at all, was forced to add $800 million to his budget because the controller said it didn't conform to GAAP. And had the mayor not made the change, the controller had the power to reconvene the control board, whose jurisdiction had lapsed because the city was in good financial shape. And I tell you that story because when I listen to all my friends here, and I've had the marvelous benefit of knowing many of the people and benefiting from the wisdom that's in this room over these last years. The most fundamental solution of this problem is to require cities and states to budget. And the only one who could force them is the federal government. And there's a total disconnect between the federal budget-making process and what happens to the state and local government.
And that's the topic of drinks that Dick and I have and we talk about all the time.
Right.
So I think when I'm listening to you, I'm looking back 50 years, and the issues are almost the same in many ways, right? There continues to be this misunderstanding between financing and funding, and elected officials, not at the executive level, but at the legislative level, love to use borrowing as a way to mask some of the underlying problems. And the easy credit has been problematic both in the 60s as well as in our current generation. So that's one thing I'm hearing from you. The second is that the control board, which took some of the politics out of finance, and we've got examples of that elsewhere in the country, whether you have a city manager model or a chief administrative officer, or the CFO of DC, for example, which is a congressional appointment, take some of the politics out and let the finances be the finances, I think is a second lesson I heard from you. And then figuring out what the impact is on the larger community. So with New York City went down, the state was going to go down. It was going to have federal implications. So you needed to understand the city in the context of the overall economy and how to pull the resources together. Now take that framework of the 60s and bring us into Detroit and into Puerto Rico, because Dick has taken a lot of heat in the press, particularly in Puerto Rico, for advocating that Puerto Rico file or seek bankruptcy protection. So why don't you talk a little bit about how some of those lessons learned in the 60s translate to today, and your thoughts on municipal bankruptcy?
Well, I think as most of you know, the Puerto Rican government managed, as being the only issuer of triple tax exempt debt in the country, to take advantage of the enormous appetite that the market had for tax exempt interest at very high interest rates. And they managed to borrow $73 billion through a variety of borrowing mechanisms that clearly violated the intent of the Constitution of Puerto Rico, if not the letter of the law. And no matter who was elected, they said, why don't we borrow the money that we need to provide for all the things we want to provide for? And as long as there were people willing to lend it, why not? There was no intervention. There was no oversight by the SEC because of the Tower Amendment. They didn't even examine the issuance of all that debt. And very frankly, at the same time that they did that, they used the corpus of the pension fund to pay the benefits, so that by the time 2015 rolled around, there wasn't a dime left in the pension fund. And leaving aside the unique fact that it's not a state, it's a territory, the Treasury Department, out of wisdom and compassion, decided the only way to resolve the problem was to get the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico involved in a bankruptcy process to resolve in the most rational way possible. Well, I probably should have mentioned Detroit first because Detroit preceded it. But let me correct myself and just talk about Detroit for a second. Detroit suffered from enormous economic and demographic change. And the state did not respond by providing the financial support to maintain this municipal infrastructure, to do anything about employment. There was a mass exodus of population. There was some borrowing, that wasn't the major problem. Why anybody lent the money at the time. And there was no money left in the pension fund. That was similar. And there were 26,000 retirees of the city of New York who had no source of income since Michigan had elected to opt out of Social Security. So they had no benefit whatsoever, these 26,000 families. Through an act of generosity and wisdom on the part of the governor, generosity from the Ford Foundation and a number of businessmen, $800 million was put together to constitute a corpus of a pension fund to provide benefits for these retirees. And they filed a bankruptcy petition after the governor had sought an amendment to state law to give him the power to appoint an emergency manager of a municipality. And he appointed a very able lawyer, partner in a Washington law firm, to be the emergency manager of Detroit. And his job was to come up with a bankruptcy plan and to try to get the elected officials at both the city and the state to do the things that would avoid an even greater human catastrophe. There were enormous protests. Jesse Jackson led a street protest against the appointment of an emergency manager in Detroit on the grounds that it was a gross interference in the self-government of the city. Well, the same thing happened in Puerto Rico. A lot of the unions and a lot of very angry people, including the Archbishop, they picketed and objected to the enactment of a law called PROMESA, which the Congress ultimately enacted to assist or create a mechanism for Puerto Rico to get through a resolution of their conflicting claims. What's interesting, particularly about that, is that the bondholders were dead set against the enactment of a bankruptcy authorization because they knew that one of its major purposes was to modify maybe the total amount of outstanding debt and certainly the terms of repayment of that debt. And they created an organization called Americans for Individual Liberty. And they campaigned vigorously against the enactment of the law. I would tell you they also attacked me in the process, which is a matter of great pride as far as I was concerned. But I learned, interestingly enough, they were located in the same street address in Virginia that the Koch brothers 501c4s were located. By the way, the Koch brothers lobbied vigorously against the bankruptcy authorization in Detroit as well, on behalf of the bondholders. So, what are the issues? The issues are a combination of technical issues and political issues in the broader sense of the word about what is your vision of democracy. To what extent do you want to take power away from an elected government and give it to a body that's appointed, that doesn't have to run for office, and give them the power to make decisions about how much money is going to be spent paying off debt, how much money is going to be spent paying off pensions, how much debt is going to be used for education, etc. Do you really want in a country committed to the idea of democracy to confer or transfer that power to an appointed board? Particularly when who is appointed is very much a function of the political attitude of the guy who's making the appointments at that point in time. And that's a very, very genuine issue. And it is a reason why some people feel that there has to be another alternative other than bankruptcy at Chapter 9 to resolve the conflicts. States, only 30 states have passed laws authorizing municipalities to file under Chapter 9. As we find states getting into greater and greater fiscal difficulty, there is a fascinating issue, which there isn't time to get into, as to whether it's constitutionally permissible to statutorily authorize states to use Chapter 9. Is there another mechanism that could be used to resolve disputes between money creditors, pension beneficiaries, and the citizens who depend on essential municipal services? I believe that these issues are just being discussed. It's the kind of meeting that you all are attending today, and there will be many more of them, and these conversations will morph increasingly to what kind of, how do we get some discipline into this process? Because no matter how carefully and how well-meaning people are, when you ask somebody to give up money, whether it's a retirement benefit or it's interest on their life savings, which they use to buy a bond, that's nothing people want to do. And on the other hand, if you asked everybody to pay twice as big an income tax or 3 times as large a sales tax, they ain't going to be very happy about that either, and they're going to move out. So how are these issues going to be resolved if we continue to grow the fundamental imbalance that you are all familiar with, that you heard described today, that you heard how that imbalance can be addressed intellectually and politically? But what we don't know, how many people are going to get elected to office who are prepared to make tough decisions? And I have to tell you, when Ed Koch was mayor, and every time the control board in New York made a decision to cut a service, to reduce the number of cops, to reduce the number of garbage collections, all of this Koch knew in advance, but when the board made it public, Koch would go on television and curse the control board. And when he got off camera, I was with him a lot of that time, he turned to me and he said, "Thank God for the effing control board." So it takes an extraordinary politician to be willing to be honest and face up to the fact that sometimes you need a prop, you need a mechanism, you need an external reason to help get political acceptance for the things that people really don't want to hear.
I think that my daughter pointed out to me recently that the millennial generation is actually now outnumbers the baby boom generation. And the millennials are getting far more engaged in like, look around this room, in the work of public policy and understanding things. So there's two parts. One is you have to understand what the issues are, whether it's gap or whether it's that bonds are not revenue, which is shockingly an obvious thing, but people miss all the time. So part of it's factual and learning. The other part is, how do we create the success stories for people who do the right stuff and take all of those hard decisions, because they're hard. When the city put together some pension legislation that would reduce certain benefit levels, that's hard work. That is not the stuff that makes you a popular person, yet I think in the long term it's kind of necessary. I want to turn to those economic and demographic changes. One of the things that keeps me up at night a lot is the pace of change in our economy and the impact on state and local governments. And I think it's kind of getting missed out there. The autonomous vehicle is a fascinating development. We're all hearing about it, and it's going to be deployed in some cities across the country relatively soon. But what about my gas taxes? What about parking? Because we get parking revenues from operation of parking lots, right? Tax revenues. But if you have an autonomous vehicle that drops you at work and goes home, you don't need parking. How are we going to begin to think about that? And what about the revenues associated with those industries which have kind of built their business and their franchise value around ignoring regulations? I mean, Airbnb is a hotel service that, in most jurisdictions doesn't pay hotel tax. Uber and Lyft don't comply with certain of those laws. So how do we change these economic and demographic changes affecting our state and local governments? How do we plan for that, Dick?
Well, I'm not surprised you asked me a profoundly complicated and difficult question, but it's of course the right one. And I'm going to give you what some people think is a bit of a smart-ass answer. We got to get better people to go into politics.
Yes.
We don't need people in
and
this,
government, not just politics.
And government, absolutely. Public service, absolutely. Yeah. And that's what's most scary about what's happening in this country now. The disincentives are enormous for people to run, for people to go into public service. And the world is changing, and our laws and our rules and our practices reflect a set of conditions that is changing, as Lois just pointed out, in very, very real ways. And it's going to take very, very creative leadership. And I respectfully suggest that the disconnect between what happens in Washington and what happens at a state and local level is totally impossible to permit to continue. That the federal government has got to look at these problems in the same way as they look at the problems of the things that the federal government is directly responsible for. Let me just give you one illustration of something that's always struck me enormously. Federal government supervises the issuance of debt through the SEC, through two laws that were passed in 33 and 34. The issuance of debt, of which there's over $4 trillion by cities and states, and the right to issue tax debt on a tax-exempt basis, which substantially reduces the cost to the local taxpayer. It isn't supervised, as I said earlier. It's a benefit conferred, and it is susceptible of being conditioned if the federal government wanted to. If they wanted to enforce some of the ideas that you heard brilliantly articulated today, ideas that make a hell of a lot of sense for how to budget honestly and how to disclose things to the public that's affected. Federal government could do that, make that all very real by conditioning the ability to issue tax-exempt debt, for example. So there is a direct relationship. Second of all, as Lois correctly points out, there's so many things that are changing in the world, and that where there should be, by all logic, a uniform national response to the technological changes, the environmental changes that are occurring, the relationship of the United States and the world. You can't address those kinds of issues on other than a national basis. And here we have a national government that makes no effort whatsoever to measure the impact, to score their proposals. They score how they affect the federal budget, but they don't score how they affect state and local budgets. And we have to have a system in which when the congressmen from Chicago decide to vote for something, they should be informed what the impact of that is on the city of Chicago and the creditworthiness of the state of Illinois. And it's not required. So there has to be improvement in that as well. I'm talking too long, I'm sorry.
So let's talk about the city of Chicago. I think we have like a minute left is about all we have, unfortunately, because I could talk to Dick about 6 hours straight. How do you think we've done? How do you think Rahm has announced he's going to be leaving the mayorship? What's your take?
Well, I happen to knew Rahm slightly when he was a congressman and when he worked in the White House. And when he became mayor, shortly thereafter, Rick was kind enough to host this gathering. It was 8 years ago, Rick, where you were sitting. And I had breakfast with Rahm and had the honor of meeting Lois. And they gave me a legal opinion from the distinguished law firm of Sidley and Austin, which said that despite the language in the Illinois Constitution, the city of Chicago could modify pension benefits to the extent of the unserved term of public employees. Rahm Emanuel made a proposal to modify those benefits, but he accompanied it with a tax increase, saying that rich ought to contribute and there ought to be some haircut in benefits. And the combination of the two would put Chicago on a better path. Well, that was a courageous thing. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court of Illinois didn't agree with Sidley and Austin. And then Illinois elected a governor who reduced the income taxes by 40% in a frenzy of self-righteousness. Somebody referred this morning to Kansas. Same thing happened in Illinois. I have to tell you, I read an article yesterday in one of Rupert Murdoch's newspapers that infuriated me because it said good riddance to Rahm Emanuel, because Rahm Emanuel agreed to pay all those pension benefits, and that's why Chicago's broke, because of all the things that he did that were so dead wrong. Well, Rahm Emanuel is not responsible for the current level of pension benefits whatsoever in the city of Chicago. And he has tried to the best of his ability, and I respectfully suggest, I know no politician who could have done better, maybe nobody else would have been totally successful either, to deal with the kind of social and racial and economic and fiscal problems that this city has faced, whereas at the same time, Chicago has become, in every other respect, a world-class city. That's why it's going to take me a long time to get to the airport this afternoon.
And on that
Anyway,
note,
thank you.
thank you so much, Dick. Thank you very much.